Serious, did you ever regret talking to a therapist psychiatrist? Why? I've been seeing a therapist for a year and it's been great. Some sessions are better than others, but it's helped me considerably with my issues of anxiety and depression. However, she suggested that I try one of the group classes, and I was hesitant, but I figured that the worst that could happen was a bad experience, and signed up for one. It went fine until the doctor-teacher asked to share what was bothering us. I was not at all prepared for this. It takes a long time for me to open up to someone other than a doctor about this stuff. I was not remotely okay with sharing this information with total strangers. I basically had an anxiety attack while waiting for my turn, and did my best to hide it when I was asked to speak, but I wasn't able to form coherent sentences. The doctor reminded me to try some of the basic anxiety coping mechanisms and I basically clammed up after that. I spent the rest of the class trying to not dwell on the fact that I had a freaking anxiety attack right in front of people. I felt worse after that than I did before I started seeking help. It only really took me a week or so to feel normal again. But there is no freaking way that I'll ever do any kind of group therapy again. Group therapy is not for everyone. You tried it and that is a good start. Keep working with your therapist, but tell your therapist about your experience with the group session. I did. I found it really difficult to talk about things and it was emotionally draining. I'm a reserved kind of guy, and I don't talk about that kind of thing. So opening up was unnatural and too much to deal with for me. I also saw a Christian therapist, which in hindsight maybe wasn't the best idea for someone questioning their sexuality. There was a time when I felt down a lot, so I figured seeing a therapist might be a smart move. She told me emotions are a triangle of happy, sad, and angry if I recall correctly. Whenever you feel sad or angry, just think about things that make you happy. That's it. That's all there is to it apparently. Thanks doc. I am happy. I should focus on what makes me angry and sad instead. Yeah, when I was in my late teens, his therapist suggested I should only think happy thoughts. That the abuse I received was my own fault for not standing up for myself. And when all of that didn't work, she prescribed a high dose of Xanax for me. Literally said she would be beating the crap out of her own daughter if she found out she was cutting herself like me. Back then, I thought this was the norm and she was right. A better therapist later on told me that she was messed up and demanded the company she was with to make sure she wouldn't ever have another client again. Apparently she got many complaints as she did this to many of her clients. As a professional therapist, I find it unbelievable that someone can go through an accredited program and come out with not one iota of understanding basic therapy skills. I'm so sorry you went through that. Yes, husband and I went to marriage counseling after a large marriage altering event. He chose a Christian counselor. I had misgivings, but went anyway. Chick basically spent every session telling us to read some workbook she was selling, not even one she had written, and then ended in prayer. Yay, not helpful at all. We ended up only going a handful of times and working things out on our own instead. Yes, more or less every time I see her. Don't know if it's just my therapist or it's like this all the time, but she doesn't seem to understand the things she suggests don't work for me. She is also very antagonizing and it feels like she blames me for the way I am as if I am bringing it on myself or something. This doesn't mean to say I regret opening up about my problems because I find talking to my mum and my brother helps a lot. Kind of, but not really. The time I went in my adult years I had two issues. Anxiety attacks when answering the phone in a new job, and no empathy. The anxiety was an easy fix, but the no empathy was caused by me being a sociopath, which I wasn't aware of. Most people feel, optionally think, do. See sick dog. Feel sad. Maybe think that dog is sad. It makes me sad. Comfort dog. But I think, optionally feel, do. See sick dog. Think that makes most people sad. Comfort dog. Carry on with day unaffected. We did some sessions on identifying correct reactions, a lot of which I was already doing, which is supposedly impressive for someone without natural feeling, but mostly it just sucked to find out I was naturally broken and it can't really be cured. I have to manually care. My natural state is being in butthole. It's good to know, but not particularly motivating knowledge. We are all broken, just in different ways. I am a psychologist and I would be happy if most of my clients had as much self-awareness as you do. Yup, She didn't understand what I told her and kept talking to me like was I a child. I mean, I was but a child back then, but she didn't change her approach after several failed sessions and didn't want to hear when I said that this method wasn't working. But neither would she listen to when my mom told her to change approach. So after roughly half a year I stopped seeing her, and my 9YO self concluded that if someone whose job it is to help people with problems could not help me, then no one could, and after that I held every feeling back and hid my emotions cause no one could help me, and I didn't want to appear weak. Mixed. At first I had a bad one that kept making me relive a traumatic experience. That actually made me much worse. I switched to CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, where I didn't speak about specific things at all, just retrained my brain handle experiences differently. That was fantastic. Best thing I could ever have done. Only took about 8 or 10 weeks appointments and the results lasted forever. The kicker here is that you did the dang work on CBT. I do CBT therapy for addictions, and some of my clients don't do the dang homework and processes outside of my office and then wonder why nothing ever changes. Like holy crap, it is work to help yourself. Put in the effort into you. I wouldn't say I ever regretted anything, but it took a lot of time and patience to find the right therapist. I don't really know how to explain it, but you just kinda have to find one that you click with. I eventually did, but she was a psychiatrist so I could only see her every 8 weeks and her job was mostly about adjusting my meds and trying to help me find a psychologist I could also click with. Yes, very much so. I struggled a lot as a teen with bullying at school and what amounted to what I now recognize as emotional abuse at home. I was very depressed and anxious. I started having thoughts of suicide at age 13. I eventually convinced my parents to let me see a psychiatrist, though they didn't really think there was a problem. I was a HS freshman at the time, so 15-16. I liked the doctor a lot at first. He was friendly. He really listened to me talk about my issues, and he was the only sympathetic adult in my life at that point, I thought. After a while, he told me the way I was being treated at home was very wrong, and he wanted me to bring my dad into a session so we could all talk about it together. He felt that if he were mediating the conversation, my dad might actually take my feelings seriously. I thought, wow, this is great. I will finally be heard. The next time I came in, I brought my dad, but the doc did a complete 180, talking about me with my dad as if I weren't even there. He told him he was doing a good job as a parent, but I was just a bad and rebellious kid who did everything for attention. The best thing to do, he said, was ignore my attention-seeking behaviors and not validate them in any way. He said he didn't believe I was really depressed at all and was faking to get drugs. A friend had died in a car accident just a few days before, so I was already in an emotionally vulnerable place. Whenever I tried to speak, they'd just talk over me, like I was just something, not a person with feelings. I started to cry, so the doctor pointed at me and said, pretty triumphantly, "See, she's crying now because she knows I'm right. I can't be right because I'm old. Isn't that right? Down here for real, Sal? You can't stand for an adult to be right." I tuned out whatever was being said after that, just quietly cried while they continued discussing me and my issues with authority or whatever. Home life worsened after that because now there was even less of a chance for me to ever be listened to or taken seriously. I self-medicated with drugs and alcohol. It was many years before I felt comfortable seeking help again. That butthole is probably retired or dead by now, but frick him. I'm still salty about it. Yes, she repeated, what I have to do is changing my personality. Feeling depressed and anxious is about my personality. Interesting. Not completely. I'm mostly convinced my therapist and I just weren't a good match, and that she was too mild for the size of my issues, combined with me not being able to explain the size of my issues very well. I came to therapy with one major problem, and through the process of her asking questions, she made it about something completely different. I wanted to talk about my problems, but she wanted to talk about completely other stuff, in this case mostly my parents. Not denying it, my parents had been a problem factor for most of my life, so I don't blame her, cause the stories I told about my parents were quite problematic. but I already knew that and had accepted that. My parents weren't the reason I went to therapy. Now, since this was my first time having therapy, I kinda told myself that she knew what she was doing and that maybe my parents did play a bigger factor than I thought. However, nearing the end of therapy and afterwards, I didn't feel like anything was solved at all. Even if my main problem was my parents, it ended up in just accepting that they were crap, which I already knew. My actual problem wasn't solved in any way, and it pretty much just ended up being a waste of time and money. The only useful thing I got out of it was general cognitive therapy strategies which deal with generally figuring out where your actions and thought patterns originate from. Therefore, I don't completely regret it, and also because it taught me how to act next time I ever seek therapy, and that is to be very clear about what is bothering you and what it is you want to solve. I do want to stress that there is rarely a reason to not go to therapy, cause I feel like this thread may be a derivative of that question. Therapy can definitely help a great deal, even if just for the sake of spilling your thoughts to someone. My mistake was that I kinda went along with whatever my therapist said or asked. You need to remember that you are the one this therapy is meant for, and you need to be the one walking out the door feeling at least the slightest bit lighter or more understood. The therapist's life isn't affected much. They will do whatever they think will help you, and if you agree too soon, they won't keep digging. It's necessary for you to do some actual prepping beforehand to make clear for yourself what it is you want and need. Stay your ground. Don't quit until you get the results you want, and therapy could be a really great thing. Yes, I told one I wanted to hang myself once and his response was, "That's interesting. That's a typically male way to die." He offered no help, just confused me talking about things that didn't apply to me after getting into an argument with my friend who was with me for support. I went to see a therapist in my teens as I had developed an eating disorder. I made it very clear to her that I, 1, was okay with my appearance, quite happy with it. I was, and still am, naturally skinny and fit and loved my body. 2, loved food, enjoyed cooking. 3, the not being able to eat was likely stress related due to the pressure of my studies and I hated every minute of it because I missed food. She determined I was anorexic, hated the way I looked and was choosing not to eat to punish myself. She would often comment on my looks and how I dressed. She then forced me to keep a food diary even after I told her doing so was stressing me out even more. She never addressed the actual root of the problem or ever listened to what I had to say, and made me scared to ever seek therapy out again. During my first year at uni I developed severe social anxiety. In my second year I went to a counselor at uni to try and get over it. I didn't obviously know what it was. I saw him every week for about 8 weeks. Always it would come back to my parents and my childhood. Every time. No matter what we talked about. It was like he had one tool at his disposal and was determined to make it fit. Finally, out of the blue he said, "You don't really want to be treated, so I can no longer help you." And that was it. Obviously almost 20 years later I am completely on top of this now that it's blown up into full-on avoidance. So in a way, the problem took care of itself. Thanks random uni counselor. I've found that avoidance does make things worse for me, and it was mentioned briefly in this one psych module I took. But yes, colon is definitely a tough one. Yep, my therapist, who has been seeing for a year prior for other reasons, had incredibly unreasonable expectations for a new relationship of mine. Talking about true love and how some people just get so lucky finding their person so young. I remember having misgivings at the time, but continued seeing her. Started having relationship problems, so brought him with me to the therapist. Turns out it was the beginning stages of abuse on his part, but my therapist said nothing. Therapist started getting erratic and giving contradictory advice in the same session. Ended up having to dump the therapist before dumping the so. Ironically, this therapist is supposedly the best in my area for post-abuse counseling. I'm scared for you now, lol. I went to see one for social anxiety and ended up being quizzed about my sex life. Within 10 minutes she asked me without prompting if I was a virgin, and then just kind of, IDK, recoiled. When I said well, yeah, that then became the new topic of conversation. Despite that not being the source of my anxiety or something I really care about that much. She was weirdly Freudian about it all, hypothesizing my lack of sex to be the source of my anxiety. and asking repeatedly about my relationship with my mother. When I eventually navigated the conversation back to my anxiety in the abstract, she seemed kind of IDK, disinterested. I eventually just left without scheduling another meeting. 1/10 would not recommend. I don't know if this counts, but I regret ever talking to my doctors about my anxiety depression. Honestly, I don't think they understand how to deal with it very well. They either give you some crappy talk you've heard 1,000 times before online that changes nothing, or shove done soul-sucking pills into your hand. I've dealt with it better through friends. Nothing has helped me more than sitting down and having a drunk conversation with a friend, who I consider a brother to me, and just spilling my heart out to him, and have him understand, and even relate to a lot of the problems I have. Professionals just don't feel genuine to me. It's like they've given this advice a million times before, and it just feels like it's automated advice at this point. They might as well just hand you a slip with all the info on it, and say better. Yep, as a teen I had a few sessions with a psychologist. I wanted to go in order to talk about some historical trauma, but my father was paying for the sessions because he wanted me to figure out how to better adapt to life with his new batshit crazy wife. After a few sessions, I found out that the psychologist was having regular discussions over the phone with my father and disclosing what I was saying during our sessions. I promptly freaked out and then refused to seek psychological help, which I really needed, for close to a decade. I told my first therapist that I have anger issues that I really need help working through because it's destroying my life. She just shook her head and goes, "Oh, I don't believe you have anger issues." I showed her a picture of the hole in my living room wall from where I put my fist through it. "That was an accident, I'm sure. You're such a sweet girl. You could never have anger issues." I tried to talk to that same therapist about my abusive, controlling mother. She informed me that she could be my new mother. So anyway, after I unceremoniously fired her, I tried a new therapist. She really seemed to enjoy getting all the hot gossip about my awful mother but had zero advice to give me. Well, that's not true. She did give me advice, once. I told her about my social anxiety-induced panic attacks every time I'm in an unfamiliar place, and she suggested that I go to a very crowded local amphitheater and just hang around and try to make friends with the strangers there. I don't see any therapists anymore. Yeep. This once there was an ED psychiatrist whom, once she found out that I am engaged, asked me, "Don't you think your fiancé will get tired of you and leave you?" Which has nothing at all to do with the current issue. What a bee. My therapist was a freaking prick. Told him I was lonely and he said I can't be lonely because I was only 22. The second therapist I went to got butt because I said I felt more comfortable working with men than women in the workplace and wanted to argue about it. So yeah, I'm a bit hesitant to see someone now. She treated me like a product and did her job like it from a checklist. I wasn't in a good mental state at the time and she pushed too many of my buttons. The most notable thing I said to her was, "Stop regurgitating the same bile you find off of the internet and do your freaking job." I saw a few therapists through the mental health center at my university a few years ago, and I came to regret the whole experience. I really hate this outcome, because it's made me feel reluctant to revisit therapy even though I can imagine it being beneficial. The first time I saw a therapist for intake, he shuffled me into group therapy pretty much immediately. I had a hard time dealing with it because it felt very, very hard to practice behaviors, which is what we were meant to do, and even harder to open myself up to talk about my anxieties and experiences. The session leaders pretty much said group therapy was a failure for me. At the end of the term, they suggested I start over with another therapist. I did just that, and saw the same therapist once a week for 5 weeks. I felt good about seeing him at first because he seemed to focus on concrete ideas I could recognize and pointed out specific action steps I could make to feel better. By weeks 4 and 5, however, the tone seemed to shift and he was being what I would otherwise call a devil's advocate. With each example I'd share or story I'd tell, he'd take the other person's side, no matter how ridiculous, and eventually started acting personally wounded by the ways I responded to that. I felt more confused and isolated than ever, and he started talking about group therapy again. I expressed concern, but he insisted. This process, minus the devil's advocate step, Thankfully, repeated for about 6 months with 2 more therapists and 2 more near immediate transitions to unsuccessful group therapy. The only thing I got out of it was feeling a bit better about being able to respond to peers and give advice perspective. But in the end I really felt attacked, abandoned, and even betrayed, and it will be hard for me to ever go to therapy again. Yep. I told her I think I have PTSD because I have all the symptoms and suffered traumatic things. She said only people who end up in A&E after being battered can have PTSD from abuse. She totally invalidated me, and I know it was ignorant, as the NHS website states you can have PTSD even from neglect, and I experienced a lot worse than just that. I just wanted to be evaluated, listened to, heard. But once again I wasn't, which was quite horrible to deal with. She was saying about how people try to find something to fit a reason and expressed I seem to be seeking too much, searching for answers. I was searching for answers, but that's because I wasn't getting proper help and I was struggling to function in normal life. Sleep terrors, emotional flashbacks, severe shame attacks, severe anxiety, dissociation, etc. Of course I was looking for answers. I also got told that I couldn't get counseling there, which wasn't her fault but the NHS fault for referring me to the wrong place. I wasn't currently being abused and they wouldn't treat people who had escaped the abuse. That was hard because I had been trying to get help for a while and my hopes kept being squashed. She also handled it all badly by having me talk about the abuse I experienced, which got me into a really bad state, then there being no closing down of that. I found it really hard to function in the following days and found myself needing to drink to calm my nerves to be around other people at work. Only time I've ever drank at work. I know that's bad, but I didn't feel I had another option to not have a nervous breakdown. Overall, it was a terrible experience and nothing came of it anyway. I opened myself up to get shot down and told we can't help you. It's the invalidation and ignorance that was the worst though. It made me lose a lot of hope and faith in the healthcare system. I can understand them being unable to help because of a referral mistake. Way late to this party, but yes. Growing up my mother made me go to therapy. She drove me every Tuesday while I sat and talked about my feelings. This happened for 2 years. One day she takes me to the therapist's office and runs in before me saying she just needs to talk to her, and she takes my appointment. After that, now my mother and I have back-to-back appointments. After a while, I noticed my mother was referencing things I had told my therapist, private things, about how I was feeling regarding the relationship with my mother. This happened for another 2 years before I stopped going altogether. I was sick of everything I told anyone by proxy be told to my mother. Was sick of everyone trying to fix the fact that I just felt neglected and unloved and like I didn't have the guidance that I needed to get through a very difficult time in my life. I have gone back to therapy a couple of times since, but I can never really feel truly comfortable talking to someone like that again. There was so much betrayal that happened there. I'm still mending that almost 20 years later. My mom ended up going to the same therapist for about 10 years afterwards. She really stunted my mother's growth as a single mom as well, and it made everything more difficult. We're just now getting our footing. This sounds like what's happening in my life now. I'm a young adult and my mother feels the need to come into my appointments with me. I never get any talking done because most of my problems are about her. I'm glad you're sharing your experience so others know they aren't alone. I don't regret having talked to a therapist or psychiatrist in principle. There is a very dismaying effect if you finally go to one and it isn't the right one for you though. So there are specific cases where I would have been better off not going and talking to the specific therapist or psychiatrist in question. But going to one in principle is a good idea. If you get the right one, your life can change dramatically for the better. Was in and out of various forms of therapy for years with childhood issues. While most weren't regret, just not the right fit, there are some I'll look back on as potentially just as traumatizing as my actual issues. There was one therapist who insisted my disorder was just lack of willpower. This, coming from a lady who was so fat she struggled to get out of her chair. Yeah lady, you go ahead and preach willpower when you haven't had the willpower to stay fit, not even fit, just mobile. Was also obsessed with frog statues and sent me outside to count them while she had a chat with my mum about how hopeless it all was. Another was a psychiatrist, the only one I went to. She told my mum there was absolutely no hope of fixing me. None at all. No hope. So, as there was absolutely no way to fix me, I obviously had to keep going back to her. Literally, if anyone can explain what the frick her logic was there, I would love to know. Also asked me intimate, useless details about my life. Yes, Ms. Whatever. The solution to my deep-seated trauma lies in the cousins I have never spoken to, or perhaps the name of my grandparents' dog. I was super lucky that my mum remained hopeful that there was a solution, and pulled me from any therapist that wouldn't work. I'm, mostly, better now, for anyone who cares. When I told him that I was worried people only hang out with me because I make jokes, he said, well, everyone has their role in a group. Great, I'll just keep trying to be funny all the time, and if I ever have an off day everybody will leave. Thanks, doc. Vulnerability is my big reason. I've never been good with confessing my issues, so when I saw the psychiatric nurse last month I felt open and weak, which is apparently common amongst young men. I've still not attended an appointment with the psychiatrist because I'm afraid of admitting that I have a problem. If I talk about it, it then becomes an issue I have to deal with. My primary diagnosis was one of an ongoing 12-year struggle with depression and a self-defeating personality disorder with potentially undiagnosed ADHD and dyslexia as a child. I went to one about a year ago. At first it was promising. Of course she told me to do sports. I'm a sportive guy. No problem. But she told me I should really start running. I hate running. It's so boring to me. But whatever. Did some other sports. At first she was listening to me and giving me advice. But honestly nothing new. I talk regularly with my best friend and he gives equally good or better advice. Everything she told me was kinda obvious, stuff that everybody will tell you. But then I started to get the feeling that she was working against me. Longer story. My GF at that time started spending a lot of time with a guy friend. Okay, know what I am worth and I'm not jealous. Time passes, nothing happens. Because we were on the kinkier side we tried a lot, and because she was my first I feared that I may be missing out on something. Whatever. I'm shy and just together with her because she was my best friend and confessed her feelings for me. What I want to tell is I have a giant problem with getting to know girls and starting relationships, something sexual. One day my GF proposes the idea of a kind of open relationship. I'm not that convinced, but she tells me I'll find a girl to have fun with and hopefully it'll develop into a threesome. Ooh, okay then. Time passes but I find no girl. Also because I'm anxious and don't want to. One evening she starts a topic about polyamorous relationships and such, and I read an article she showed me. I get a bad feeling all of a sudden and we talk and she admits that she has feelings for someone. Punches in my stomach. I already know. You guessed right, the dude. Okay. Did something happen? We kisses when we both were drunk. Some weeks ago and she didn't tell me. I was sad, furious and felt betrayed. I knew in this moment that she just pressured me into this to not feel bad about her feelings for the guy. Back to the therapist. I told her how I felt and she says I'm wrong. I have no right to feel this way and I'm childish. What frick you? I'm not telling you anything anymore. Had a couple sessions but basically lied to her about stuff because I had the feeling she personally stacked me with what she said. Worked out with my GF after I took some LSD and opened up to her again. But at the beginning of the year she broke up with me. Feel like crap at times and consider getting therapy again, but know for sure I'm not going to my old therapist. Don't blame yourself for what your girlfriend did to you and don't let anyone else tell you otherwise, even if it's a therapist. Cheating is wrong and not telling you're so crap like that is even worse. I hope you find your peace and happiness in life. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.